I want to welcome everyone joining us this afternoon, evening, or late night, or possibly morning, depending on where you are, for our conversation on our February focus, Poetry and Story at the Intersection of Climate and Race. Last 2 weeks ago, we had the webinar. It was a different format for us. About a year ago, Dr. Richard Waugh introduced us to some of the statistics about climate and poverty. And we're beginning a series of conversations now on systemic racism and climate justice and poverty, how the three of them connect in ways that we're not even conscious of most of the time. Just a reminder that our overall theme is the flourishing of life for all. And we just want to quickly highlight what's coming up next. For March, please join us on Sunday, March 20th, when we will be going deeper into eco-justice and facing some of the uncomfortable truths. Again, there'll be a 2-week between the webinar and the conversation, which will happen Sunday, April 3rd. We're trying to avoid Palm Sunday and Easter and every other day that can be challenging on the calendar. So I think with that said, I'll turn it over to Dean.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to remind us that at our last session with Ashia Ajani 2 weeks ago, it, as Joan indicated, marked the beginning of our effort to highlight the relationship between our climate emergency and racial and ecological justice. And as background for our conversation today, I want to briefly discuss something called the groundwater metaphor. It's developed by an organization called the Racial Equity Institute. And I'll repeat that, the Racial Equity Institute. You can Google it and you can see much more about their use of that groundwater metaphor. But it basically illustrates that reality that we live in a racially structured society, and that is what causes racial inequity. And the metaphor is based on 3 observations. One, that racial inequity looks the same across all systems. And secondly, that socioeconomic differences don't explain racial equity in and of themselves. And finally, that inequities are caused by systems, regardless of people's culture or their behavior. Now, embracing those kinds of truths helps leaders confront the reality that all our systems and institutions and outcomes emanate from a racial hierarchy on which the United States was built from the time that colonization began. In other words, we have a groundwater problem and we need groundwater solutions. And so this slide suggests that if you have a lake in front of your house and one fish is floating belly up dead, it makes sense to analyze the fish. What's wrong with it? Now imagine the fish is one student, for example, failing in the educational system. And we'd ask, did it study hard enough? Is it getting the support that it needs at home? But the next slide raises the question that if you come out to that same lake and half the fish are floating belly up dead, what is it that you should do then? And this time you've got to analyze the lake. Imagine the lake is the education system and half the students are failing. And this time we might ask, might the system itself be causing such consistent, unacceptable outcomes for students? And if so, how? But now picture in the next slide, a group of lakes around your house. And in each and every lake, half the fish are floating belly up dead. And what's it time to do now? We say it's time to analyze the groundwater. How did the water in all these lakes end up with the same contamination? On the surface, the lakes don't appear to be connected, but it's possible, even likely, that they are. In fact, over 95% of the fresh water on this planet is not above ground where we can see it. It's below the surface in the groundwater. And this time we can imagine half the kids in a given region are failing in the education system, half the kids suffer from ill health, half are performing poorly in the criminal justice system, half are struggling in and out of child welfare, and it's often the same kids in each system. There is racial inequity across systems in education, medicine, law enforcement, child welfare, and neighborhood infrastructure, environmental protection, flood control. And when we get down to business on climate adaptation and mitigation, the same disparities are likely unless we change the groundwater. And so this is why we've begun incorporating discussions about racial inequity and racial justice into our climate crisis series. Rod? Next slide. Now we're now going to share an audio clip with comments from Paul Bethel, who's been a participant in many of our sessions. And this clip was during our discussion session in January. Now, Paul's become the newest member of our Climate Justice Committee. He was recommended by the Pacific Southwest International Mission Center because he serves as its sacredness of creation advocate. Now, Paul grew up as the son of an RLDS church appointee in Japan and the Midwest, and met his wife, Jackie, while both were in school in Lamoni, Iowa. They currently live in Southern California, and they help co-pastor the Gardena, California congregation. And you'll likely get to know Paul better over the months, I'm sure. So let's listen to this audio from Paul.
From the last seminar, something that I think Randy mentioned was Vanessa Nakate. And so I obviously Googled her. And what I took away from that is we are so stinking filthy rich that it's not affecting us. And, you know, we have the luxury of talking about 1.3 versus 1.5 versus 1.8. And yet, and there's several young African militants who are screaming that, you know, what you're doing is killing us. It's not a discussion. And she mentioned Madagascar. Madagascar has gone for 4 years in a drought. And I think the UN says there's something like 30,000 people are on the brink of starvation. And hundreds of thousands are in dire strait. The only difference is they don't have the money that we do, and they're not white. You know, California has been in a 4-year drought, and our discomfort is that if we water our lawn within 48 hours of a rain, we can get fined. So that contrast to me is just, it's really overwhelming. And it's almost distressing how analytical we can be, and yet there's so many people in the world for whom it's life and death. And several of these, you know, I mean, you should Google them. They're all very articulate. They all seem to know their stuff. But you know, they're saying, hey, the people that have caused this problem the least are the ones who are suffering the most. And it's just because we've absorbed all the resources, we have all the money that we can, and we've had disasters. I mean, we've had, you know, Texas froze, people without power for 2 or 3 days. We've had wildfire. I mean, Seattle and Portland had 110 degrees, but we didn't have 30,000 people dying. You know, Bangladesh right now, there's something like 6 million people displaced because of their homes are underwater, and it's supposed to get worse within a generation. And yet, you know, that would be like taking the entire population of LA County and say, hey, grab your stuff and go. And we can't conceive of that because they're far away and they're poor and they're not white. And you know, we have the luxury of being able to be analytical about it, when in fact there's people that are dying.
That recording of Paul's comments from a month, I think, or so ago, I think create the dichotomy very clearly. Now, you might recall that at the session 2 weeks ago, one of the things that I shared was a timeline of the history of racial injustice in my particular community in Bellingham, Washington. And I suggested that a homework for you all who were there might be just to do a similar kind of a bit of research with respect to your own community or your state or town or whatever, about what's been the history of racial injustice in your community. And so I thought I'd just give you the benefit, any of you who may have had a chance to do that, of sharing briefly, a couple of you, perhaps in chat or raise your hand, what kind of research you've had an opportunity to do that reflects the kind of racial inequity or racial justice history that your community has experienced. Anyone want to venture an observation? Cecil, is your hand raised? Were you just pushing the screen? Go ahead.
No, I was, I don't know what I was doing.
Okay.
We've had 6 incidents here with largely African-American people complaining about Black lives mattering and not mattering, depending on which side of the street you were looking at. And I've discovered in trying to figure out what they want that one group wants exactly what the other group doesn't. They want to they disagree totally about how we might solve the problem. And the more I try to look into it, the more I discover that it seems like a hopeless disagreement at this time. And I don't have the knowledge and the background needed to make a helpful suggestion to either side.
Well, thank you, Cecil. But the fact that you're exploring and you're thinking about it, I think, is the important thing. So thanks for your observations. Sharon, you raised your...
Yeah, thank you. So I'm here in Hood River, and my congregation, I participate with a Lutheran Methodist cooperation called Spirit of Grace. And 4 of us members are participating with Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon, Reckoning with Racism. And they did this last year. I participated, started the new year with them in October. And we just got off a Zoom meeting with some of the members of our congregation to share with them what we're discovering in the Hood River area and Oregon, and the land that Spirit of Grace is on is stolen land from the natives. And all of Oregon has. And so we were sharing some of the information, and the Wasco and the Wishram people were part of the Hood River area, fished. And then there were the 1855, the superintendent of the Oregon Territory received orders to clear the indigenous people from the native lands. And he did so by negotiating, and that's loosely termed, with the natives, a series of treaties. But really what took place was the land was given to white men by the government, 160 acres if you applied, and you had to come out and clear the land and develop it. So we're clearing forests, we're stealing the land from the indigenous people. And then it also goes into 5 years prior to 1850, Congress passed the Oregon Donation Land Law. And by 1855, I think it was like millions of acres were stolen from the indigenous. So, and continuing on with the reckoning with racism, in 1942, now Hood River is an orchard community, a lot of apple, pear, cherry, lots of orchards. And the Japanese had much of the land here and were, orchardists until Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the Executive Order 9066 to intern the Japanese Americans. And so their land, again, land was stolen from them. And when the war was over, I think Hood River went from 10% Japanese population to 1%. And then Oregon has a whole history of Black prejudice. I mean, the very beginning of Oregon State, they prevented any Black people from living here. And so we just saw a video about the prejudices that Oregon had. And even until 2001, the legislature wordage of Black inhabitants didn't change till 2001. So yeah, I think I've got to be hopeful that once we understand our history, critical race, Native, Indigenous, Japanese, American, Chinese, Hispanic, we need to understand their suffering so that we can make restitution and make changes in our own way. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. And Paul and Susan have both mentioned in their respective communities, Santa Ana back in 1906, on the pretense of a leprosy case, burned 250 Chinese homes to the ground, effectively driving the Chinese community out of Santa Ana in California. And here in Seattle, I don't know what the date was, Susan, but a mob burned down Chinatown after driving the Chinese immigrants out who had lived there.
1885.
1885. Other research people have done about issues of racial injustice or inequity that reflect in your community? Lila? You're muted. There you go.
Excuse me. I just recently heard a professor at UT Austin named Leonard Moore interviewed on the radio. And he was saying how the ownership of property is a prerequisite, or the lack of ownership of property is a prerequisite for long-term people staying in poverty. And this was an example that he cited. He said there was an African-American family in 1950 who wanted to buy a house in Dallas, a suburb of Dallas called Highland Park, which he said at that time was a middle-class neighborhood. But they were denied that because they were Black. So they were able to buy, they were not able to buy the house in Highland Park that they wanted, but they were able to buy a house in a different neighborhood called Oak Cliff, which was a middle-class neighborhood. Now, he said, interestingly enough, yes, they were able to buy a property, they were able to buy a house, but they weren't able to buy the house that they wanted to buy. And the interesting thing now is, he said that the house that they wanted to buy in 1950 is now worth $3.5 million. The house that they were forced to buy because of racism is now worth only $500,000. So he said, there's the example right there that proves my point.
Yeah. And Joan has mentioned that in Southwest Ontario, Black soldiers who fought in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 on the British side, I take it, were granted land. But then when other white immigrants from Europe came into Canada and the need for land was sharply increased, those Black homestead families were driven out and those lands turned over to white European immigrants. Maybe time for one more example of someone who might have done some research. I'm looking for hands. Well, I know that if each of you were to look into the histories of your communities, you'd find similar examples. And I think the reason we're highlighting this is that because it's systemic and it permeates institutions and the decisions that institutions make, as we talk about the climate crisis, it will insert itself into those kinds of situations as well, and the way in which we mitigate against the climate emergency. Susan?
Yes, one last comment from Paul in the chats. Interracial marriage was still illegal in Missouri until 1969.
Wow. About the same time that case in Virginia occurred, I think, as I recall. All right. I think the basic point is, as I mentioned, that as we explore these issues of the climate emergency and the impacts, that we need to be paying attention to the different impacts and the inequities that may occur, both in terms of how those impact communities, the situation in Hurricane Katrina back in the last decade, and the impact on the lower Ninth Ward, predominantly Black neighborhood, is just one example. And flooding along the coastline, of course, is one of the big threats that we're facing. So that's just to highlight that. We're now going to go through some slides that are highlighting themes from Ashia's presentation 2 weeks ago. And for each theme, I'm going to invite 1 or 2 or 3 of you to make comments as time allows. So please raise your hand and one of us will call on you, or otherwise you'll, again, feel free to put your thoughts in the chat. And Rod, can you bring up that first screen? One of her themes she began with was the notion that when we seek justice, and particularly racial justice, its foundation is love. And she says, indeed, this is a quote from Bell Hooks in one of her books, indeed, all the great movements of social justice strongly emphasize a love ethic. The widespread assumption that ethical behavior takes the fun out of life is false. In actuality, living ethically ensures that relationships in our lives, including encounters with strangers, nurture our spiritual growth. Now, we're all familiar as part of our enduring principles that love is a universal value. But I'd just be curious to know what some of you think about this idea that ethical behavior doesn't need to take the fun out of life. Do you have examples of joy derived from behaving ethically in your life? Somebody's going to need to help me watch the screen for hands raised and call on people. Anyone have examples of some situation you've observed where people behaving ethically actually created a joyful experience, or you had in your own life as well. Doing the right thing.
Dan Whittemer.
Dan, go ahead. Dan?
Well, the joy that I'd like to indicate is the joy my wife and I have, knowing the help we're giving Indigenous people through scholarships and some social programming. We'll be going to people we never know, we'll never know. And the greatest joy that we've received in the last few years is knowing that we've set up various structures in which Indigenous people will receive benefit through higher education, legal degrees, and elsewhere through 4 colleges or 7 colleges and universities in my area. But that brings a great deal of relief. The unique part of it is the help goes to people we'll never know.
Thank you, Dan. Another example anyone has? Behaving ethically brings joy in our lives.
Paul?
What that made me think of is I listen to people lament or even whine and complain about being politically correct. And to me, what that means is we want you to think before you use some of those racial slangs that I suspect all of us at one time or another have used without thinking because it was culturally acceptable. Except now we're learning that those are offensive to people. With my background, the yellow peril, the Japanese and the Chinese being run out of. I can remember when I was in junior high in Michigan, being called slant eye. And I hadn't really thought about, having grown up in Japan and then moving to Michigan, I had never been called that, but it was common. And when I hear people whining about, oh, you have to be politically correct, no, you have to be civil. And if you know something is hurtful, you shouldn't use it. And for people that want to continue to use that because it's taking the fun out of life, I don't buy it.
Got it. Let's go to the next slide, Rod. And this is a quote from Elizabeth Barrett Browning. "Earth's crammed with heaven, but only he who sees takes off his shoes." That should be off his shoes. And I think Ashia's observations were that so much around climate change is about not paying attention. If it's not fully within our line of sight, or if it's not happening around us, we tend to think it's not happening, or it's happening some other place, but we all do inhabit Earth. And so once you tune into that awareness, it opens the door for a certain level of grief, because you see how certain things are getting destroyed, how particular communities are being affected. But you need to have that foresight. You need to see heaven on earth in order to act. So anyone have any thoughts about Ashia's assertion that paying attention to nature and to climate change opens us up both to grief, but also then to act, to choose to act? The implication is that opening our eyes, we first experience grief, but that becomes a motivation to act as well. Any of you have experienced grief just observing what's going on in the world around you, or more broadly throughout the world?
Susan Gregory.
You'll need to unmute, Susan.
Exxon oil spill made me physically ill. All of that oil into our beautiful, beautiful ocean, and it's still there. It's still there. That it's things like that that are just so horrific. It's kind of like you almost don't want to think about it.
Joan?
You know, I've been following climate change and concerned about climate change for 20 years, but the science keeps getting more sophisticated. And 10 years ago, you know, the impression was this was something that was gonna affect them in the southern hemisphere and the equatorial regions. It wasn't really gonna impact us. And now we're finding that, wait a minute, Canada and the US, it's now impacting us in some cases more severely. And so I think that that bit about paying attention, it's kind of like, to me, there's a freight train barreling down on us, and we're not paying attention, or like the saying of rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. And I don't say that out of a doom and gloom scenario, as just, you know, so much of a call to pay attention and understand that the science keeps getting more precise all the time. I mean, this is brand new science, you know, and so it didn't start out, you know, as accurate as our weather forecasting say, and our weather forecasting, even after all these years, isn't all that accurate anyway. So I'm just, yeah, paying attention.
Perhaps one other observation?
Lila?
I'm just going to say that those comments that she just made make me think of the passage in Doctrine and Covenants that says, in their welfare resides your welfare.
Yes, very good. You know, another study has come out recently as people have assessed the sea level rise once again, just in the last few weeks. Here in Bellingham, they're now predicting, and in the Bay Area and the Salish Sea, a 1.5 foot rise in sea level in the next, I think it was 10 years, by 2030. The reservation will be cut off under most flooding conditions that happen seasonally because of that kind of sea level rise. Susan, did you want to add something?
Only that Mary Mitchell has her hand up.
Okay, go ahead, Marion.
When I see pictures on the news or whatever of the amount of garbage in our waters, especially in the ocean and even in our lakes, I tend to grieve with that and try to make an effort to not use as much plastic or to recycle what I do have. We had an excellent, I don't know if it was a documentary or it was a news item, about a man in Newfoundland who was taking this to heart, trying to clean out some of the harbors and the ocean. And the amount of stuff that he found was unbelievable. Old tires and stuff from boats that were just thrown overboard in a harbor because they were either old or not usable anymore. And he finally, after I don't know how long, months of doing this on his own, with a bit of help from some other people, was able to get some money from the government to help pay for doing more of it. And it made me think how much, you know, we need to really do something about it. It was amazing the amount of garbage he found in a harbor, particularly in the St. John's, Newfoundland harbor, and then he was working in some of the other harbors around the coast of Newfoundland. It was an amazing documentary.
Thank you. Mark, can you switch to the next slide, please? I think the next slide is titled, "You Only Leave Home When Home Won't Let You Stay." And Ashia's comment was that disaster reminds us of our humanity and the fragileness of existence. It also reminds us of what we could be doing on a daily basis to support one another. So if a disaster were to come through again, we'd have the resilience and we would have the resources to make it through. Now, I think the title's reference was to a poem that Ashia included. I think I got the name right, Worcestershire's poem about immigrants forced to leave war-torn Sudan, now made worse by climate change and the advancing Saharan desert. Ashia reminds us of our mutual need for empathy and support, that existence is fragile. So do you have any examples to share from your own life or situations you know about where there's been support provided for those experiencing disaster that drives them from their homes? Certainly in the border area here around Bellingham and up toward Vancouver, the floods from about a month and a half or two ago, more than 1,000 families were driven from their homes, and many of them have not yet been able to return. They would have stayed if they could have. Susan?
So one of the things that happened, this last summer were terrible, terrible wildfires, where whole little towns were completely wiped out. And the good news is, they're getting some support, but what's interesting is some of those people are homeless now. I mean, literally homeless. And so not enough support is given. The problem is, of course, the wildfires are a definite indication of climate change, and it's only going to get worse. I hate to sound like gloom and doom.
Cecil has his hand raised.
I have a friend who lived at a military installation on the East Coast who got up one morning and found that the water was now, as my wife just said, 5 feet deep in the basement. And it was a disaster for them and for their neighbors that the water will come that high and destroy their property. And the only way we're going to stop that is to get better control of our own atmosphere.
Susan?
I have fled with other church members from houses along the beach in French Polynesia as a tsunami threatened Haiti. Stood on the cliff at the church watching the water churn over the tall breakwater into the harbor, and found myself with the other women beginning to evaluate how much food we had, how much clean water we had, how much toilet paper we had to last, how long we could survive there at the church with the meager resources that we had brought with us from our
We lost you again, Susan. Oh, so I think we've lost Susan. Diane, you raised your hand.
Yes. When we had the wildfires in the Portland area, it talks about helping one another out. There were a lot of people that were gathering together and offering to take large and small animals to their homes because they lived out in the country and they were further away from the fire. And they would kind of put themselves into danger by going into certain areas with their trailers for the larger animals to get them away. And so that was just another thing that reminds us the power of, seeing disaster and realizing that, there for the grace of God go I, or whatever you want to say, or the grace of not necessarily of God. God didn't do that, but just the circumstances. It could have been me. And so I felt uplifted. At the same time, it's certainly a lot more real when it gets to 113 degrees in the country, and in my hometown, or my town that I live now, and we're having fires that aren't that far away from us. It really wakes you up a lot more when you hear them. In Australia, you're praying and you're concerned, but it just kind of heightens things up a little bit when it's in your backyard and you realize that we are all in this together and we need to get things going.
I see a hand raised. The first name isn't there. Ronneberg?
Yes, Gail.
Gail, thank you.
I just wanted to share a story in our area here in Northern California around the Sacramento region. On the nextdoor.com, there was a young mother, 3 small children, but she was so touched by the people whose homes were destroyed in the Paradise Fire, she formed a nonprofit called Julie's Purse. And she started collecting used purses from people and filling it with toothbrushes and sanitary items and some jewelry and some little treats in it and that kind of thing, and started handing those out. And it has grown now since that Paradise Fire. She's done this for a number of homeless encampments and other fires that we've had in Northern California, to where she outgrew her garage, and how she's managing this with 3 small children to do this. But the people have just rallied, and she now was able to or had to get a storage unit. It's a huge storage unit, and you see the pictures, and it's filled with constant donations. So that encourages me that there are a lot of people in the world who do have a sensitivity to the needs of others and are responding to that.
Thank you. Joan?
Yes, I live in Colorado, and on December 30th, we had a terrible wind, and it resulted in fire that spread through over 1,000 homes in Boulder County and burned them. And one of the families was associated with our mission center. And so we put out a plea, and we were able to raise over $12,000 for that family. And then also I heard on the news where this one man in his organization, I don't know what it's called, but they're raising money and buying these huge RVs and parking them on the lots of the people, of the victims, so that they can move back into them if they don't have enough funds right now or are not able to rebuild immediately. Yeah. So we're trying to help. Yeah.
That's great. Laurie, last comment.
All right. So I am just really attracted to this word resilience and asking that question of where resilience comes from, because I think it's one of the things we can actually learn from marginalized communities who are facing what we're talking about, only magnified. Like, we live in a place, as Paul was mentioning, where this happens. I keep a go bag in my car all during fire season now, but there's a place still to go. There are tens of thousands of refugees crossing the border even today. And so where does that resilience come from? And I want to also tie this back just with my noticing with our comments that that love is the foundation of that resilience. And it arrives by paying attention and opening our hearts, allowing it to grieve so that we care to act. So there's a thread here that Ashia was creating for us. about, from love, creating a willingness to look at what we don't want to look at and what hurts too bad to look at, but we've come to love, and so we're willing to do it. And so we come to these places of resilience. And I'm just wondering, as I hold the thought of having to actually leave my homeland, another act of care and love is European countries throwing their borders open to masses of people coming across them, even as we speak.
Yeah. The next slide is really reflecting on what we've just been doing, the power of storytelling. And Ashia said the storytelling has been a part of human communication for millennia. Even before we had language, humans had ways to share stories. Because climate change is such a contentious topic, oftentimes if you have a human narrative behind what is happening, people start to tune in more. And I want to mention that Ashia was gentle with us in nudging our awareness of the intersection between climate crisis and racial injustice. What stories do you have that illustrate that connection between climate and race? And just a couple of stories we have time for. If you have some connection about a story that you know about or that you've experienced that connects these issues of the climate crisis and racial injustice. Laurie? You still have your hand up, or maybe that was from last time. Okay. Susan, I think we lost her connection. So I'm Rod or Joe.
I'm back.
Okay. All right. If you could just help with anybody who's raised their hand in response to this question. What stories do you have that illustrate this connection between climate and race? Well, certainly, Laurie alluded to the migration issue, and I know she was thinking about Europe right now, but perhaps also about our southern border and the reality that much of that migration is being driven by the catastrophes of the climate impact in Central American countries, which is a particular example. And I think there are probably numerous stories we could discover if we were to speak with people who are there at the border trying to find a new home because they've been driven out of the one that they didn't want to leave. Any other thoughts about that? Maybe it's enough said. Let's go to the next slide, Rod. She made this connection for us between the notion of freedom and the notion of a place, having a place. And when we're thinking of environmentally neglected communities, people say, oh, well, it's because they don't take care of their community or their neighborhood. But not everyone has the same encounters with nature. Cutting humans off from nature is a colonial enterprise that prioritizes productivity and extraction of labor over reciprocity. And this really alludes to this comment of Ashia's, alludes to the fact that we're being asked these days really to rethink the European settlement of the Americas as a colonization of a land already occupied by millions of indigenous people, and that used enslaved people from both Africa and indigenous America to generate our wealth. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's freedom to create the poetry that we saw an example of at the beginning of the slide and that Ashia used was a privilege derived from a colonial enterprise. Her family's wealth was derived from plantations using enslaved people in Jamaica. She was herself forever ashamed of that legacy, and that's why she became an ardent abolitionist. What benefits have you derived from your freedom to encounter nature? And what would it look like to envision freedom as a place for all? What value have you found in your ability to connect with nature?
Peter DeMol has his hand up.
Peter.
I'm sorry, that's Michael. Michael DeMol.
There's an indigenous writer who quotes another guy that says, this is an Indigenous Australian writer. He says, for Indigenous nations to live, colonial mentalities must die. Now, once upon a time, slavery was accepted, and once upon a time, people used to think that women were inferior to men. But all that's changed in recent times. There is modern day colonialism, and it's rampant. You've just got to open your eyes to see it. And I think that labeling things as colonial and bringing it to attention to people as a colonial mentality might help change things, just as slavery was changed and the equality of men and women was brought about by raising these issues. But I think calling something colonial might help raise awareness of things, because it's rampant as modern day colonialism. You've just got to open your eyes to see it. We're talking about it now. That's all I had to say.
Thank you, Michael.
I think Joan has her hand up.
This makes me think about the Northeast power failure in the summer of 2003. People on the West probably don't remember it the same way people on the East remember it, when power went out everywhere for almost a week. What I remember is that in New York City, there were thousands of people who saw the stars for the very first time in their lives. And for somebody like me, that's mind-boggling. But when you really think about this whole urbanization taking people off the land that anchors them in family and community and history, and moving towards cities and working, at jobs, it's such an artificial life. You can get just so completely disconnected. My grandchildren, I think they think milk grows in grocery stores, and that we would just make more if we ran out. It's just such an artificial thing, artificial life, when we have that disconnect.
Laurie made the comment that, you want to embellish your comment, Laurie?
Well, actually, what I really want to do is put myself in the place of those for whom their entire world is concrete and no greenery. And that's, I know the extended quote, which I don't have in front of me, from Ashia, went on to talk about these communities that simply don't have access to nature because of how they've been marginalized. And I can't imagine not being able to have the ability. My heart, my soul would wither if I was not able to go out and sit beneath a tree or work in a garden. And to realize that this colonial enterprise, in order to allow persons who are wealthy, mostly white, to have this privilege, takes away nature from other people, just is a place that really breaks my heart. And I really noticed too that as Joan was talking about being able to see the stars again, disaster is not being able to see the stars, not being able to have the width and breadth of the natural world and kinship with it. To be cut off from that is what we're talking about. And that's what the colonial enterprise, as I'm learning about it, is about. It's about cutting that off, because I don't see you as worthwhile. I see you only as something that I can exploit for my own purposes. And yeah, I just, this pieces of Ashia's thing just really hit me hard, because I have actually hiked with people who've never been out into a park, and how frightening it is. I can't imagine that. And we need greenery. We need the rest of the world to thrive. If we want flourishing of life for all, yeah, I'm done.
Brenda?
I would just like to say I'm from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada, and I've just been listening in because I sometimes wonder what I can do, but there are small things. But where I live, we're in an awakening, and we are in a time of realizing resilience. I like to hear that word of our Native brothers and sisters, of the unmarked graves. I'm sure you have heard this story. But as they let us know about their ways and become voices that let us know how they feel and how it has affected their family, they also are letting us know how they respect and really just nature is their very being. And they're teaching us so much, so much. And some of the voices are really loud, but there are many voices that are just wanting to be seen and heard. And they are through their music and through sharing some of their customs with us. We just want to dance today. We just want to dance in nature and give thanks to Mother Earth. Is music to my ears. These resilient people that are still trying to be the people that God planned for them to be, I think.
Rod, if you could move to the next slide, continues this theme of envisioning freedom as a place. And I'm going to read Ashia's statement. And then I'd just like us to sit with that statement for a while in silence as you consider it and as you think about examples that you know to be true. We know that frontline communities who are most going to be impacted by climate change are communities of color. They are Black communities, they're Indigenous communities, Latinx communities, Asian communities, Middle Eastern communities. And that's globally, not just in the United States, or I should add Canada. But already, many people of color live in environmentally unsound communities. And I just invite you to sit quietly with that statement as you think about examples you are aware of. The maps of spring always need to be redrawn again in undared forms. And Ashia's questions were, in what ways are we willing to live so that we can have a better relationship between humans and the earth? What things are we willing to give up? What things are we willing to sacrifice? And what things are we willing to invest in? Now, as you think about the disparate impacts of the climate crisis on people of color and other ethnic groups and nations, how do you see your maps of your life being redrawn in the world and in your community, in your neighborhood? And we'll just share a couple of thoughts. How do you see your maps of life being redrawn in the world, in your community, in your neighborhood?
Gary? Gary, you'll need to unmute. Gary, unmute yourself.
There, finally got it. Sorry, I should have been prepared. I keep thinking about how human perfidy, human misanthropy, whatever you want to call it, has been played a part. I mean, look at what's happening in Russia right now. Look what happened in Brazil a few years ago when Bolsonaro refused to let anybody go and put the fires out that was burning the forest. Like, and you start to think about it, and we from the developed world have spent the last 300 years becoming developed by exploiting the resources and everything in the third world countries, right? So now the people in third world countries are standing up and saying, well, we claim title to some of this, we want some of this, but it can't support them and us in the manners of which we've all become accustomed. It can't support them becoming more like we are, and it can't support us staying like we are. So I think what we're talking about here is a very significant, much bigger subject than just, you know, like what can I give up on a daily basis? Like, can I maybe drive less? Can I do something? Yeah, that's great. But I think we're talking about an endemic problem that is worldwide. And how do we change the structure of colonialism that still exists to some degree, so that third world countries have the right to develop the way we did, the way we exploited their resources without destroying what's left of the world's resources. So that's, I can't kind of get past, what do we do about that?
That's a pretty good explanation, Gary. Any last thought, anyone?
Peter?
In Kate Rayworth's book, Donut Economics, because of, I haven't got time to go into donut economics here, but it's they produce a booklet called Creating City Portraits that helps bring justice to the world. And it asks questions like, how can my city reflect, but be, oh, I got a mental blank. It asks 4 basic questions that help bring a city in line with what we need to do. And so the idea is you study these 4 questions with the people of your city, with community leaders, local government, and then you try and bring these systems into line within your local area that help bring justice to the rest of the world. It's called Creating City Portraits, and it's by the acronym they use is DEAL, D-E-A-L, which you can look up online, which is Donut Economics, something else, A-A-L.
Can you put that link in the chat or email it to one of us on the committee, and we'll make sure it gets up and available for people to refer.
I'll email it to Susan. I think I've emailed it before. Maybe she can share what I've emailed, but I'll see what I've got and what I've done.
Thank you.
I have.
I'm going to turn it over now to Paul to kind of set the stage for our next several sessions, we hope, with some observations and some illustrations. Paul?
Okay, so things we've talked about recently, which was the UN COP26, there were several young Black activists like Vanessa Nakate, who point out over and over that the countries that contributed the least amount of CO2 are the ones that are suffering the most, and that the current 1.2 degrees Celsius rise in global temperatures, while it's uncomfortable for the rich countries, which would be us, but it's deadly for many developing countries. And she's from Uganda, so she's specifically talking about what it's doing to her country. And most of the countries that are suffering are almost exclusively non-white countries. And I think we have to ask ourselves if we would be more concerned about climate change if if it were forcing white people from their homes by the tens of thousands. So I know I have to admit that I'm kind of guilty of being apathetic about global climate racism. But here we want to transition to environmental racism closer to home. So I'm going to share a story that I ran across that it's sort of creepy. There are more pigs in North Carolina than there are people. And that's the case in several other states. I think Iowa and Wisconsin are also included in that. But in the southeast part of the state, in one year, 10 billion gallons of pig poo is dumped into huge pig poo pits. And you can see the picture there. They call them lagoons because that sounds better than pig poo pits. So the contamination from these lagoons caused dangerous levels of nitrates in the groundwater and hydrogen sulfide in the air. And one might wonder, what does one do with 10 billion gallons of pig poo? Well, to get rid of it, we spray it into the air. And my first reaction to that was, ew. But then another article that I checked clarified that the pig poo was sprayed into the air on fields as fertilizer. So you can see the nice house in the background there. So can you visualize moving your family to a home that is anywhere near a pig farm or anywhere near a place that pig poo is being sprayed in the air? And I'm guessing that most of us on this call have the resources to avoid that particular home buying decision. So you'd be correct if you guessed that the home values are depressed in any area remotely close to these massive farm operations. However, if you're one of those people who struggles to make ends meet, lives paycheck to paycheck, have a low income job, you may not have the options that most of us do. And low income communities tend to be Black, brown, and indigenous people. And that's who tends to end up living around these types of places. So people that live anywhere close to these farms suffer from headaches, eye, nose, and throat irritation, nosebleeds, asthma, diarrhea, upper respiratory conditions. And if you look at that picture there, you can guess that wind direction has a huge bearing on how your day is going to go if you live anywhere close to these places. So this is one example of a polluting industry that can only survive around communities that don't have a voice. They don't have advocates, they don't have the resources to do anything different. So that is one example of eco-racism, where people are living in areas that are simply unhealthy and polluted. Rod, can you go to the next slide? Because I don't want to mention the effects of Hurricane Florence, but all these farms flooded. And you can just imagine what it was like there when you have 10 billion gallons of excrement floating around everywhere. So the next slide, Ron. If you've ever had your day at the beach ruined, this takes it to a whole nother level. And you can see what that did to the coastline there. So if that story kind of ruined your craving for a BLT, sandwich, I apologize. But if you take a moment, think about your neighborhood. So, well, okay, not your neighborhood, but say your town or the areas where you live. Where are the less expensive places to live? Where do the people who work the hourly jobs, who work paycheck to paycheck, where do they live? And then visualize those areas and what is around those communities. Quite often there's industries there. There's polluting areas. So at this point, can you think of any examples in your areas where you live of places where people are living in unhealthy or polluted areas because they can't afford to live anywhere else? And we don't care if we pollute those areas or not. Anyone think of anything in your area?
Even when in our town of Camas, Washington, the sewer area, the sewer treatment area, you know the people that are living around there are these small homes, and their place isn't going to be worth a lot and that kind of thing because of where it is. So that's even human waste. But all of those kinds of things, you see in different communities. You don't see these big fancy homes all around waste treatment plants.
Yeah, Paul.
Yeah, Gary.
I live in Abbotsford, BC, which is a traditional farming community. We had a big flood this year, which a lot of people heard about. 600,000 animals were killed. A lot of those were hogs. But the impression is that the farming areas around Abbotsford are the wealthier areas. There are big, big homes because a lot of them are South Asian people that own them, and they have the entire family living in the home, so they need a 10,000 square foot house. But if you drive through the farming area here, you see a lot of huge homes with huge barns. Now, how they dispose of their waste, every spring, the smell in this whole town is exactly what you described. My cousin used to say that's the smell of money, because it was the fertilization for the crops and for the animals and for all that other stuff. So I think it can be both. I think it can be an area for, where poorer people congregate, but I think in a case like this, it's an area where wealth is created, and that wealth can cover up a lot of sins, if you get what I mean. Like, I don't know what they do with their pig poop here, but I know that there was an area the size of Squim, Washington, that was underwater for about 3 months. And I'm suspicious that we probably suffered a lot of what you're talking about, but it was never mentioned. There was none of the things that you were talking about ever applied to our farming community. And I'm wondering whether that's a calculated oversight.
Yeah, quite often there's not a lot of publicity about major economic engines.
Yeah.
Susan? Yeah.
I'll just mention my sister Laura lives in St. Joseph, Missouri, which is kind of a deteriorating town that doesn't make the headlines, but it has had a number of floods from the Missouri River recently. All of those floods have occurred in South St. Joseph along the borders of the town. most of the, and there's industrial areas along there, but it's also the poorer sections of town that live in the south part of St. Joseph along the river. And the wealthier people, the retired white population, I think they live up on the cliffs above the river where they aren't touched by the flood. So when there came to be reparations, I shouldn't say reparations, repairs that were made in terms of the flooding, it was the folks up on the hill that got first crack at the finances in order to make sure their sewers were clean and that water was not backing up through their pipes. And the levees down in the southern part of St. Joseph were basically ignored. And so the river flooded not once, but 2 or 3 times, and they still are not fixed. I think that's an example of eco-racism, where the voice of the less economically privileged folks have been ignored in their needs in order for the privileged to be empowered and protected from even the possibility of inconvenience. I might mention that at no time did any of the plumbing up on the cliffs seem to be in jeopardy.
Any other examples of? I'll mention one just briefly. It's something my wife's working with. There's a company called Kingspan in Santa Ana, California, that is trying to unionize, and they're trying to clean up their plant. They weld and they work with fiberglass.
Yeah, my name's Michael tomorrow.
And
I have an appointment there
they have
tomorrow
a problem with particulate matter. And I know one story they were saying that—
Michael, can you mute? Thank you.
Yeah, one of the problems, I heard one of the guys saying that the EPA forced them to buy this ginormous riding vacuum cleaner to vacuum their parking lots to pick up the dust and the particulate, the fiberglass, and there's some other chemicals, so that it doesn't remain on the ground or go into the water. But it costs a lot to run that. And the employees there were saying, instead of using that, they just give one of the hourly guys a leaf blower, and they clean the parking lot with the leaf blower, putting all that up into the air, into the community, which is predominantly a Latino community. So that's still a pending thing that's going on right now. And Kingspan is a green eco type of company making green building materials. So anyone else have any examples from your area?
Well, I also think that here in Seattle, it's obvious when you look around that there are fewer green spaces in the lower income neighborhoods. And that too is eco-racism. It's like, who was it, Laurie, I think, who was talking earlier about how it hurts to see the lack of nature, the lack of the possibility of interacting with nature when you live in a concrete desert. But that happens in Seattle. It happens in most of the major metropolitan areas I've ever lived in.
To Laurie's closing.
Okay. So I have been asked to bring us into prayer today. And what I'd like you to do is take, if you can, if you're not in gallery view, to go into gallery view. You don't need to look at my face as I'm talking. I'd like you to go into gallery view and look around the faces who are on the screen with us, being drawn from all parts of the country, the world, really. We have Canada, the US, and Australia at a minimum represented here. The piece, as you're gazing around, that I'm going to say this over and over again, you're going to get tired of me bringing this up, but two things. The thing that racism and white supremacy have in common with climate collapse and environmental catastrophe is this capacity to see the other as an object, to objectify another human being and exploit them so that I can be more comfortable, or I can have this, or I can have that. It's the same kind of looking and seeing and saying, I can exploit the land. I can pour pollutants into the air. I can do all these things. And so this link between white supremacism and racism is grounded in our ability to see the other as an object instead of as a subject in and of their own right. And yet we look around at each other's faces. And in this moment with our conversation, we don't see each other as objects. We see each other as beautiful and subjects who have our own lives and our own desires and our own sense of confession around these issues, our own sense of wanting to act. And this is the nature of the God that calls us to prayer. Colonialism has also colonialized our images of God. It has tried to make of God someone who can support white privilege instead of a kinship for and among all creatures. And because of that, we need to give prayer a new language. And one of the things that I've really been experimenting with is this possibility that we shouldn't be praying for other people. We need to be praying with other people. So this is the prayer I invite you into in our last few moments, and then I'll close with a prayer of my own. But I invite you to move into your heart and imagine someone whose name you don't know, whose face you can't see, who even now in the world, because someone is trying to make of them an object, trying to rob them of their humanity or a creature of its very existence, who is praying right now, and I invite you to pray with that person. Maybe it's the mother of a Russian soldier who's already died. Maybe it's the sister of someone whose brother is fighting on the streets of Kyiv to hold their territory. Maybe it is a bird in a tree whose home is being knocked down by tanks rolling over it. Maybe it's someone in your community who is struggling and praying and asking. I invite you to take a minute to pray with them as they pray. Weave us together in a web of kinship and love that encourages us and gives us the courage to see and to act, but also help us to know that we are not responsible for the whole picture, only for the seeds that we can plant. And in that spirit, I pray with this prayer that honors Oscar Romero, the Archbishop who refused the institutions of colonialism and sided with the poor and marginalized in South America. It helps now and then to step back and take a long view. The kingdom is not only beyond our efforts, it is even beyond our vision. We accomplish in our lifetime only a tiny fraction of the magnificent enterprise that is God's work. Nothing we do is complete, which is a way of saying that the kingdom always lies beyond us. No statement says all that could be said. No prayer fully expresses our faith. No confession brings perfection. No pastoral visit brings wholeness. No program accomplishes the church's mission. No set of goals and objectives includes everything. But this is what we are about. This is what we are about. We plant the seeds that one day will grow. And we water seeds already planted, knowing that they hold future promises. We lay foundations that will need further development. We provide yeast that produces effects far beyond our capabilities. We cannot do everything. We cannot do everything. And there's a sense of liberation in realizing that. This sense that we cannot do everything enables us to do something and to do it very well. It may be incomplete, but it is a beginning, a step along the way, an opportunity for the Lord's grace to enter and do the rest. We may never see the end results, but that is the difference between the master builder and the worker. We are workers, not master builders. We are ministers, not messiahs. We are prophets of a future that is not our own. Amen. So I think I'm supposed to just remind you again that we are going to extend this conversation with more input around this intersection between social justice and ecological justice. We're going to be going deeper with that, looking at uncomfortable truths about systemic injustices and issues of conflict and how those are connected to climate change. And at the same time, we hope to learn from marginalized communities about resiliency, about choosing not to be objectified, about choosing hopeful ways forward. So join us on March 20th. And as you can see in your calendar, a follow-up conversation on April 3rd. And that is, well, let me close with this. Again, President Vesey's invitation to us, a prophetic people, must accurately discern true realities that may not be apparent to others, or realities they may not want to face. I want to thank you for choosing to spend this afternoon trying to face realities that we may not want to face, so that we can become prophets of a future that is not ours. Good to be with all of you.
Okay, yes, you can all unmute and say your goodbyes, and wonderful that you were here. And I hope you are starting to recognize the significance of being here and participating. And I appreciate that.
Good to see you all. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.